Hello and welcome back to Jack Knives Reviews. I'm of course your host, Jack Knives. And as you can see, I am dressed far more casually today. Why? Well, because I wanted to do my annual top 10 list. However, I wanted to do something a little bit different. You see, I was thinking about it the other day, and realistically, it's somewhat difficult to get newer horror fanatics in the making. And what I mean by that is a lot of people that are mainstream horror aficionados like myself don't really know the proper way to introduce either their young ones or newer people into the horror genre, dipping their toes into the pool of horror. And so I thought it is my duty as your horror host, your nerd renaissance painter, to help you kind of traverse into the field of horror for a newer genre. So I decided to make this list. These are my Tier 1 horror movies. Now, when you hear the term Tier 1, you may be a little confused. You see, there are several tiers in the horror genre. Specifically, ones that range from nothing is any sort of effect on you, which is basically you're dead inside, which is top tier. I believe that's a tier 5. 4 is somewhere where I am, where I'm more than qualified to talk about the horror genre, but I also do have a little bit of leeway to be actually scared. 3 is right in the balance of most people. 2 is you are new and you are thriving and trying to get into it. And here we have Tier 1. Tier 1 is just starting, needing a little push into the right direction. So I wanted to pick 10 movies that technically fall into the horror genre, but aren't specifically overtly gross, weird, dark, and going twisted and twisted and twisted as much as the horror genre gets. Now, keep in mind, this isn't a definitive list. In fact, I would dare say that this list will constantly be revised. These are just 10 that I specifically would just randomly pick, that if anyone's asking for a direction, where to go. Before we start on the list, though, I do want to give some minor criteria. One, this is not going to be a list surrounded by goth central things or Hot Topic-esque things. So don't expect to see Nightmare Before Christmas, Beetlejuice, or Gremlins on this list. Those movies, while technically within the realm of horror, aren't specifically horror movies themselves. These are movies that, for better or worse, are classified as horror films. So with that being said, let's get started.
Squad.
12-year-old Sean Crenshaw and his best friend Patrick are monster fanatics. Along with their friend Horace, nicknamed Fat Kid, junior high tough guy Rudy, Sean's kid sister Phoebe, and little Eugene, they come together and talk about monsters. But when Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Gill-Man, and the Mummy come to their small town to get an amulet, it's up to the Monster Squad to stop their evil plan and save the world. Monster Squad is the perfect blend, 80s classic kid and adult horror goodness. It's not quite a straight up advert horror film, but it's got the elements of a horror film, enough to separate it from, say, a movie like a Beetlejuice. I feel that it has a really cool way of just standing on its own and being a movie of its time, but also being timeless in that way. I mean, the kids act like almost no kids you've ever met, and yet they do stuff that every kid could relate to. Like hanging out with your friends and just talking over stupid stuff and just getting so into it that you don't even think that you sound nuts, but you really do. Casually drop stuff and say stuff without even thinking it sounds weird. One of my favorite parts is where the main kid goes up to the teenage boy and just goes up to him in the middle of the cafe that they all hang out with, and while he's in the middle of drinking a Pepsi, he's like, "Hey, Rudy, know any virgins?" And he just, while he's in the middle of his Pepsi, just does a full-on, genuine spit take, and I'm like, that is awesome. Or how the little girl has kind of a smart-ass mouth on her. Like how she's like, don't be a chicken shit. Little things that you kind of relate to, but you're also laughing so hard at. But then there are parts of the movie that just like really like sucker punch you. Rewatching it, like there's one scene in particular that really stuck with me where there's a character named Scary German Guy where they want to ask him to read a book of Van Helsing to get these monsters back to their hell realm, I guess that's what it is. And he's reading it, and then the kid, when they're leaving his house, says, "Gee, mister, you sure know a lot about monsters." And he says, "As a matter of fact, I do." As he's closing the door, you see a Holocaust tattoo on the dude's arm, like of the numbers that they would give at Auschwitz, and you're like, holy shit. What the hell? What? That's how crazy this movie gets. You're like, what just happened? It's beyond fun, crazy. It's chaos. It's pure chaos, but in the greatest way possible. And it's got to be one of those movies that everyone should at least see more than once. It's just fun. I mean, it has timeless lines like "Wolfman's got nards," which, if you haven't seen that movie, is a very weird thing to say, but if you know, you know. And that's the testament to how weird and fun this movie is. And I feel that it's one of those movies that anyone of any aspect of horror would really just find something about it that they'd like.
Killer clowns from outer space. It's crazy.
The town of Crescent Cove becomes the hunting ground for a group of aliens disguised as clown-like creatures. Their goal is to harvest the humans for sustenance, using weapons both hilarious and terrifying to get their prey. It's up to Mike and his friends to stop these killer clowns before it's too late. I was amazed at how many people have really clung on to Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Specifically little kids clinging onto it. I don't know whether or not it has to do with the actual concept of the clowns or the concept of just it being this far-fetched, crazy, wacky, really just silly horror film. But it does have a great amount of charm to it. It's kind of like a person who made a Halloween costume out of everyday household appliances. Even if it looks silly or dumb or goofy, you gotta admire the person's aspirations as far as creativity. And this movie kind of encapsulates that feeling of that kind of Halloween nostalgia too, because you sit there watching it and go, man, these people are dumb. I mean, one of my favorite line deliveries is from the sheriff when he says out loud casually the name of the movie, almost in a way to the audience to say, you're seriously here for this movie? But what I think I like most about it is it centers around just pure chaos in its entirety. You look at films like Gremlins, and you look at films like Critters, or even lesser extreme movies like Ghoulies. And you look at these movies and go, why doesn't the military intervene? Why don't the police intervene? Why doesn't anyone do something about this other than maybe 2 or 3 people? And the movie just never really gives you a reason. It's just, it's so stupidly funny. I love that this movie has kind of become a cult following for no real reason. With all due respect to the Chiodo brothers, the movie in itself, ironically, like a bunch of cotton candy, is mostly just kind of scene to scene to scene to scene. It's very much fluff for the sake of, this scene is funny, let's film this scene, it's funny, film this scene, it's funny. There's not much as far as plot, but there is a lot of charm to it because it's so just goofy. Scenes like how one of them has boxing gloves and literally punches a dude's head off, or how there's a cotton candy gun that turns them into liquid that they use to drink to fuel themselves, and yet they're supposed to be clowns, but they look too weird and twisted to be clowns, but everyone's just, okay, they're clowns. It's just hilarious, crazy chaos. I really think of this movie as what would be if candy corn was a movie. Take it, you like it, you hate it, whatever. It's just there. It's there to enjoy or not. But you kind of gotta respect the charm that came with making the film and getting it from print and simultaneously now finally getting appreciated. David Mann is a salesman who is driving cross-country when he is harassed and pursued by an old oil tanker driven by an unseen driver. As the cat-and-mouse chase continues, David must summon up the courage to turn the tables on his pursuer. So many people that are super familiar with Steven Spielberg now, with his many critically and publicly acclaimed films, would be shocked to realize that this is one of his best movies. Specifically because he was put into the bubble that is primetime television. He was tasked with actually releasing this movie for technically the ability to be broadcasted both on television and in movies. And with that, he did use it proper. This is one of the few times where I feel that it surpasses a lot of his later works. Whereas a movie like Jaws, which is universally acclaimed for its horror and suspense building, does have a lot of pacing issues as far as compared to the modern aesthetics that is horror, and for a newer casual fan. I feel that this would be the proper step. For anyone in the horror genre to go. It's not overtly gory, it's not overtly crazy, but it is manic. It shows that typical fear that anyone who gets behind the wheel is always afraid of. What if you're nonstop pursued by a crazy maniac in a giant big rig? What if someone's after you? What if you don't know why they're after you? What if you can't escape them? What do you do next? And this movie encapsulates that feeling so well. I think that Dennis Weaver is very underappreciated for his performance in this movie, because it feels as though with this sort of a movie, you need a central character to fully integrate the film into. When you have a movie that's centered around one specific character that you have to follow and not many other people to talk to, you need to have that character be so either interesting or relatable that you as an audience need to connect with him. And I feel that Dennis Weaver pulls it off perfectly with his character of David Mann. We never really truly get an idea of why the truck driver's after him. We barely ever even see the truck driver. We get sort of shadow silhouettes of him. But even though the film is made back in the 70s, it does still stay relevant to this day because, as I said before, we all know that sense of just a manic, crazy person just after you. I feel that this movie was the blueprint for what would become the movie The Hitcher with Rutger Hauer, where it was pulled off perfectly. But this movie does show a great sense of just danger that anyone can just pop on and enjoy. It really does put the blockbuster film on its head. And considering Spielberg is known as the king of blockbusters, you can see why watching Duel.
Buffy, the Vampire Slayer.
Buffy Summers is a popular cheerleader who is approached by a mysterious man named Merrick, who tells her that she is the Slayer, with superhuman strength and abilities yet unlocked, destined to fight vampires. As fate would have it, her high school has been overtaken by them, led by a powerful vampire named Lothos. Now, we're all familiar with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, but to go further back into the roots and look at this movie on its own, think of it as a pseudo-pilot. Realistically, the blueprints are there for what became of the show. You have a blonde cheerleader who basically is the savior of the planet with given super strength to fight monsters. You have a suave, cool guy who's her love interest. You have a mysterious but interesting elder figure who knows the secrets and needs to teach them to her. And you have a whole bunch of vampires just out of the woodwork that she has to fight. It's fun, schlock, goofy, teen drama romance comedy. It's a comedy. It's a horror. I mean, it's more of a comedy than horror, but it's got the perfect balance of both. And I like it. I love it. I honestly think that there are parts of it that I could see kind of almost do it better than the series. I feel that Kristy Swanson has a lot more subtlety than Sarah Michelle Gellar does as Buffy as a character. And part of me wishes like this was like an alternate universe Buffy, and like that Buffy and the TV Buffy ever interacted with each other, which isn't that far out of the realm of possibility in the Buffy universe. Let's be 100% honest. Late Luke Perry does a fantastic job as this suave, cool guy. Also, the late Paul Reubens steals the show as this character who's just this goofball vampire, but he has this deep, dark voice that you could tell he's trying too hard to look cool, but he just doesn't pull it off, like Rutger Hauer, also no longer with us, having played this just suave, stereotypical vampire. Donald Sutherland has a lot of charm to him too, because he just feels like the stoic mentor. And you could see elements of each of these characters that would later be adapted into Buffy. Not verbatim, but the blueprints of what they became are there in the movie. So if you do either love the Buffy the Vampire series, or if you just want a fun little romantic comedy horror movie, Buffy's got you covered.
Don't provoke us or we will.
Gemma, a robotics engineer, creates an artificial intelligent doll for her company, and to help her recently orphaned niece, Katie, dubbed the Model 3 Generative Android, or Megan for short. She becomes Katie's protector and self-aware enough to want to take out anyone who crosses her path. So, I really didn't have a huge inclination to see this. I've seen multiple movies of doll runs amok stories, even outside of the Child's Play and Chucky franchise. But there is some interesting elements in Megan that I like about it. For instance, I like that they kind of switched it a little bit on its head. The woman is fully aware that the doll is sentient, that there's something wrong with its programming, that it's kind of corrupting this girl, and it's kind of getting under everyone's skin. I do wish they did a little more as far as the gore aspects, and I do think there is a sequel in the making. I did get to meet the girl who played Megan under the mask right here. Very, very sweet young lady. I do hope for the best in whatever project she works on in the future. But what I do like about it is that it brings out this kind of question of parenting and choosing not to parent, or letting technology take over your parenting duties, and how it affects your child, how it affects the judgment. I feel that it kind of dabbled on it, but it didn't do it too much. I also feel that this is a movie that pretty much everyone has seen. My favorite scene is probably the viral clip of her dancing and using the paper cutter. But I do love the part where she stretches out that bully's cheek, because it gave me very much Ichi the Killer vibes. There's quite a bit to this movie that I feel has just enough charm to maybe warrant one more sequel. But if they do another sequel, I feel that they need to up the ante, as far as the visual effects, as far as the practical effects, and definitely as far as the gore. But I do feel it's a great movie to introduce people, especially if they get kind of paranoid around inanimate objects in uncanny valleys. I think it's a great movie to start someone off into that kind of subgenre and just see where it goes.
Paranormal Activity. Paranormal Activity 2.
Micah and his girlfriend Katie are tormented by an evil spirit. Micah decides to set up cameras in order to capture footage of the spirit's activity, but things go very wrong. Around the same time, Christy and Daniel are having suspicions their house is being broken into, but instead are horrified of the footage captured by their home security cameras of spirits destroying their lives. I'm technically cheating here because I do feel that these are technically two halves of the same story. Considering they take place within the span of the same time frame, it's not really cheating. Besides, the movies aren't really that long, so I feel that connected together, they could be a good double feature. However, I do lean more towards the second Paranormal Activity movie being 100 times better than the first. Mainly due to budget limitations, but primarily due to the main guy, Micah, is one of the most irritating people I've ever seen in a horror film. And considering the back catalog of horror that I've seen, that's saying quite a lot. He is just so freaking annoying. I wanted to see him die so many times. And I think everyone in that movie, literally, even in the audience when I first saw it, were literally just like wanting this guy to shut the hell up. And I feel that kind of immersive experience when I first saw the movie. When I've seen any of these movies, there's never been a single part where I've been like, oh! But I could see where a lot of people would find it scary, especially if you have a religious background or if you feel that you're connected to any sort of spirituality. However, I feel that it kind of is a great way to introduce people into the POV, found footage horror genre without overwhelming them. With it being centralized around one house in the first movie, and one bigger house in the second movie. The second movie really plays off more on what kind of limitations and extras can we do with a higher budget. And they pull it off really well. I like parts where you see the woman dragged off upstairs going upward. Like, that was really, really cool. That was unique and kind of different in a way that I hadn't seen before. The Hispanic housekeeper literally sages the place, and she tries to tell the family, like, hey, there's spirits, there's evil spirits in here, and they don't listen to her, and she just leaves. I'm like, wow, smartest woman in horror, way to go. That's also why you don't have a lot of Hispanics in horror. They just leave. But I do think that it has a good balance of not showing too much, but showing just enough. There's a little bit about it that does date it quite a bit, and considering it's over a decade old, and the series went so far off the rails, I think they're going to come out with like the 9th one or something like that. I don't know. I stopped watching after part 3. It got really stupid. Although I will say, if you haven't seen it before, I do highly recommend the Paranormal Activity Japanese spin-off movie. It has nothing to do with it. It's just called Paranormal Activity Tokyo Nights for some reason. But it takes elements of the first movie that actually makes it a little better. For instance, in the very first movie, you see Katie standing above the bed for hours on end. Now, take that same concept, but in the Japanese one, the main girl's legs are broken. I'll just leave it at that. On Halloween 1968 in the town of Mill Valley, 3 teenagers, Stella, Augie, and Chuck, come across a book of scary stories written by a cursed young girl in the 1890s. The stories start to become real as all of the teens in the town are picked off one by the monsters from the book. I honestly can't remember a horror movie as divisive as this was. I remember when it came out, everyone was just crapping on it because it wasn't as scary as the book, and it wasn't as crazy as the book, and it wasn't as enticing as the book. But the thing of it is, the books themselves are folk tales that you tell in a setting to children. And I 100% agree. The books are far more scary, but they're scary because of the atmosphere built around who is reading them. About the visuals that are in each story inked with just this chaos, blood-centered ink that just splatters the page, that centers into your mind. To turn that from page to screen is like nearly an impossible task. But for all intents and purposes, I feel that they probably did it as perfectly as they really could, with the exception of the Jangly Man. Everything is practical effects. I mean, Guillermo del Toro did all the makeup effects for the monsters, and you could see it. They look like they just came out of the book. The White Lady looks like she does in the book. The Scarecrow looks like he does in the book. Toe Woman looks like she came out of the book. This feels like the book. But the problem is the book doesn't have a flowing narrative. It's just stories to stories to stories. The books are called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. They're literally just scary stories that are just surmised into a compilation. So how do you make that into a book? And how do you make that into a movie? Well, I think the movie did a proper job. Take the concept of the stories, make them turn into a reality, center it around the 60s, and have at it. That's pretty much what the movie is, and I think it does it in an extremely well done way. The kid turning into the Scarecrow, it's one of my favorite death scenes I've seen in the modern day as far as horror films are concerned, because it really looks just cool. I don't know why so many people crap on this movie. I mean, yes, it's not as scary as the book, granted, but is it a bad movie though? No. Even one of my favorite YouTube channels, Ryan Hollinger, crapped all over this movie and said it was terrible, and yet he's praised several movies that are hot, flaming piles of horse shit. But it's just weird to me. I'm like, what is the hate with this movie? I don't understand. I really do feel that this is a movie that you could introduce someone into the horror genre without overwhelming them, show the concept of a visual aesthetic that transfers from book to film, and you could actually show the proper makeup techniques in a modern context that can work with practical effects. I mean, it's a good movie. I really do feel that it is a good movie. Do I think it's one of the greatest movies of all time? Absolutely not. But do I think it's one of the best horror movies in the past decade or so? I could argue yes. I really could say that. Especially for a movie with this big a budget. Teresa Tree Geldman wakes up in the dorm room of her classmate Carter, who she hooked up with the night before. Going back to her dorm, she tries to enjoy the remainder of her birthday, but through a series of circumstance is killed. However, she wakes up in the same dorm room again as if nothing had happened, realizing she is stuck in a time loop, and the only way to resolve it is to get back at the babyface killer and find out who's been killing her over and over again. Blumhouse has been now at the forefront, centered around what it is to revamp independent horror films. Seeing as every horror film now has basically become a rehash or remake or sequel, it's really fresh to have a studio that is willing to literally look at stuff like this and go, hang on, why don't we try some different stuff? Why don't we try different aspects of things and make it focused around just an element of a story and work off of it? And it all started with Happy Death Day. Now, Blumhouse has essentially created a subgenre of horror that I refer to as concept slashers. What's a concept slasher? Well, take Happy Death Day, for example. What happens if the movie Groundhog Day met a slasher film? Happy Death Day. Imagine you keep getting killed over and over and over again, and you keep coming back over and over again. And you need to figure out who is killing you before you run out of lives, essentially. And now they've had so many of these concept killers that it kind of is, you'd think it would get stale, but they're actually pretty cool the way that they just kind of take a simple basic concept and just kind of do something unique and different and play off of that. That's what the horror genre should be. Taking the elements that we would normally think are far-fetched and stupid and do something great with them. But it all started with Happy Death Day. The movie is actually written by comic book writer Scott Lobdell, who is one of my favorite writers who worked on one aspect of the Convergence series, and he also wrote the X-Men Apocalypse comic book, which basically is like telling of the universe that Apocalypse came from, where he's wiped out all of the X-Men. One of my favorite storylines in all of comics. And I've gotten to meet Scott Lobdell. I wish I had known he worked on this movie, but now that I do, if I ever see him again, I definitely will have him sign a copy of this movie. Jessica Roth is great as Tree because she has just the most organically bitchy college girl who's just so sick of everyone's bull. It's At first you're like, oh, she's just kind of a mean, snooty bitch. But after a while you're like, oh yeah, now I get it. Like, now she has justification to be a bitch, but as time goes on, she starts becoming nicer and kinder. It has a great dynamic between her and the main guy, Carter, who is like a super nerd and goofy. It shouldn't work on paper. There's been multiple movies that I've seen where it's taken the concept of a Groundhog Day, repeat time travel, that don't really work. But for some reason, Happy Death Day does work as a slasher film. It works as a slasher film, as a whodunit, and it works as a why is this happening, which we're never really given an actual reason until Happy Death Day 2, but that movie isn't really that good anyway. But you should watch it if you really like this first one.
Poltergeist.
The Freeling family move into a new home and are slowly overtaken by supernatural forces. These forces are so powerful that their youngest child, Carol Ann, is taken to the other side. Now the Freeling parents need the help of a spiritual medium to get their daughter back before the spirits keep her and the Freelings forever. What happens when you take the creative grindhouse mind of Tobe Hooper and the fun, whimsical family blockbuster creator of Steven Spielberg and you splice them together? You get the greatest haunted house film of all time. Poltergeist, to this day, still holds a place in everyone's mind, hearts, and souls as this movie that just feels uneasy, feels unnerving watching it. It has some of the best practical effects you've ever seen in your life that have never really been surpassed. It has some of the best jump scares. It has just this element of bringing in a balance of spiritualism without overplaying its hand. So many people have tried and failed to replicate what made Poltergeist so good. Even the Poltergeist sequels aren't as good as the first one. With Craig T. Nelson as the main father, he has this real sense of urgency, anger, frustration, and confusion about what the hell is happening to his world. With the adorably sweet and innocent Heather O'Rourke stealing the show with iconic lines like, "They're here," just elements of it that just really gets you uneasy. When you think of a term like a cursed film, this is the movie that you think of. Even though by all intensive accounts, that's been debunked over and over again. People to this day still believe that it is cursed. And there's so many elements that kind of back up to it that maybe it is, maybe it could be. If that adds to the enjoyment of the film and the actual elements that make it more classic to you, then more power to you. I also highly recommend, if you've never gotten the Blu-ray, to try to get the Blu-ray copy with all of the booklets. It tells a fascinating story of behind-the-scenes featurettes and what actually came behind the making of it, with just this overwhelming sense of true heart and soul and love for it. It's really just worth anyone's time to sit down and watch it. The Torrance family are given the task of taking care of the Overlook Hotel during the winter season. Danny, the youngest member of the Torrances, sees visions through his psychic abilities referred to as the Shining that could be the oncoming warning of the hauntings and terrible actions yet to affect the Torrances. Directed primarily through his father, Jack. Every element that makes this movie work, on paper, shouldn't work. There's things about the movie that the more you read the behind the scenes, make you appreciate it even more watching. The fact that Shelley Duvall, unfortunately, has been permanently mentally scarred by the making of this movie. The fact that Stanley Kubrick did so much wrong with this movie that if they had the unions proper back then, it would have been shut down hundreds of times. The fact that there are hidden messages, hidden meanings, hidden purposes, that everyone who worked on the movie was never the same after. And the fact that even the book that it's based on's creator outright can't stand the film. But for all intensive purposes, it's not just a masterpiece of horror. It is a masterpiece film. It is a perfect balance of the true madness within each of us. When we put ourselves through the breaking points, when we get to that element where we are no longer what we were and only show the worst aspects of who we are, that is where Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance thrives. Because yes, there have been adaptations of The Shining that follow the book more proper. And yes, the book shows Jack Torrance as more of a loving, caring father who just got drunk a couple times and went insane. But Jack Nicholson, even prior to going insane, you knew there was a darkness behind him. Because it's Jack Nicholson being Jack Nicholson. He had this element about him. Whenever he would do a performance, he brought out this darkness behind his eyes that we as an audience never truly understood until we saw it. No one could perform like Jack. No one acted like Jack. And no one could play Jack Torrance as well as Jack Nicholson did. For as crazy and demented as Jack Nicholson was, Shelley Duvall was that much sweeter, kinder, and more caring. When they do the infamous bat scene, where she's flinging the bat around, they did that scene over 200 times. So when you see Shelley Duvall's performance, she is no longer waving the bat in defense against Jack Torrance. She's waving it at us. Waving it at Kubrick, specifically, to beg him to stop. And he wouldn't. Her hair literally fell out of her head from the stress of making this movie. There's so much of this movie that is heartbreaking from the behind-the-scenes aspects. But there's also so much about it that adds to its horror. It is pure in its impurity. It is a classic in the sense of this film is of its time and could never, ever be made in any aspect today. From one of the greatest creative filmmaking minds to an unhinged, unlashed madman behind the camera, and we are strapped in from beginning to end to see where it goes. And that is why I put it at my number one. It's not just a perfect movie for a horror fan to watch. It is a perfect film for anyone in horror and anyone aspiring to be a filmmaker to watch. So those are my top 10 Tier 1 horror films. Do you have any recommendations? Are you enjoying JACK-O-WEEN? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see you next time.